Well, breaking news coming out of the upcoming NATO summit. Turkey has made peace with Finland and Sweden and has decided to allow them to be invited into NATO. And so it's only a matter of time at this point before they formally accede to NATO. And all they had to do was throw the Kurds under the bus because, not enough countries have done that already. I mean, it is pretty funny how, at the end of the day, we have all these wars, they come and go. There's new wars, there's old wars, but in every war, somehow, the Kurds have to get screwed over. I mean, it's sad, but it's pretty hilarious. So Turkey was not going to allow Sweden and Finland into NATO because they were too friendly to the Kurds. And of course, Turkey hates the Kurds. The Kurds want to separate from Turkey. They want to separate from Syria. They want to separate from Iraq and form their own country with bits and pieces of those other states. And so Turkey was not going to just let Sweden and Finland into NATO without getting some concessions from them. And what they got was a condemnation of the Kurds from Sweden and Finland, countries which were previously friendly to them and their political organizations, specifically the PKK and the YPG, which also are considered to be terrorist organizations because they do engage in military activity. They have waged war against ISIS, Turkey, the state of Syria, the various jihadist elements in Syria. Really, anybody who gets in the way of them governing their own lands. And I believe they even have some supporters elected to the parliaments of Finland and Sweden because there's been so much migration from the Middle East to these Nordic countries. That they're a big enough constituency within those countries to have their own sort of PKK YPG representatives in those countries' parliaments. So, is this a huge shocker? Not really. It wasn't a shock when Turkey originally blocked their entrance, and it's not that big of a shock to me that they would, throw the Kurds under the bus. In order, because they don't really have to do anything. It's not like Finland and Sweden actually are engaging in any sort of military action in the Middle East. Although I, for some reason, I feel like Sweden was a part of the coalition of the willing that went into the Iraq War. But putting that aside, basically, these are two, militarily speaking, these are non-entities. Although Sweden is a big arms exporter, I guess potentially the Kurds at some point in the future could have bought arms from Sweden, and that wouldn't happen now. But they condemned the YPG and the PKK and said, hey, we stand strong against terrorism, and, made just some bland statement like that. And so now we will have Finland and Sweden in NATO, which is exactly what we need, considering that it's not like the existing states within NATO aren't causing enough trouble, with what have you, with Lithuania trying to blockade Kaliningrad, and the Poles pounding their chests, sending their own troops into Ukraine to fight in the war. We just had an incident where I think like 80 Polish troops were killed in Ukraine. So will this change anything? In my estimation, really no. Other than limiting in the future Sweden and Finland's own foreign policy. They are now locked into whatever it is that Washington and Brussels want to do. They have outsourced their foreign policy to, essentially the EU and the US, but mainly the US because NATO is pretty much dominated by Washington, although you have a lot of crazy Eurocrats. They really are the same people. It's hard to tell them apart. The EU and NATO. But this means that Sweden and Finland are going to be cut off from Russian energy in the future. That's inevitable at this point for them. They've lost that option of trying to make deals with Russia for cheap energy. Although, if I remember correctly, the Nordic countries are, compared to, continental Europe, much less dependent currently on Russian energy than, say, a country like Germany. I think that the battle lines of the new Cold War have been drawn, although I hesitate even to say Cold War just because it's so stupid. You know, it's a wall of separation. That's the only way to really think about it. And it's a wall this time that's being imposed by the West, not by the East. During the Cold War, it was Stalin who, laid out the Iron Curtain, who hung the Iron Curtain, I guess you'd say that, across Europe. But this time it's Joe Biden, it's Boris Johnson, it's Olaf Scholz, it's Emmanuel Macron, Mario Draghi to a lesser extent. You know, Draghi still, as I repeatedly remind you folks, Draghi is an unelected central banker who is dictator of Italy. He still has sort of that banker business sensibility, and he realizes how stupid a lot of this is. But because he is, part of the European elite, he has to go along with this, anti-Russia tirade. So the longer this drags on, the war in Ukraine, I mean, the more hardened the lines between the Ruski Mir, the Russian world, and the Western world become. The ascension of Finland and Sweden, which are not a part of the Russian world to begin with, their ascension to NATO is just emblematic of this hardening, of the barriers between these two spheres of influence. Once upon a time, Finland was ruled by the Tsar of Russia, but that was a very long time ago. That was before the Soviet Union. I've heard Helsinki looks like a little version of St. Petersburg. But despite that imperial heritage, the Finns, like the Hungarians, are very much their own very, very distinct group in Europe, with a language that is not really similar to anything else on the continent. And so they were never really going to fall into the Ruski Mir long term. Sweden, of course, is a Germanic country, very close to Norway. Norway's been a NATO member going back to the Cold War days. So I think it's just sort of putting a formal stamp on something that was understood for a long time. Sweden is not really neutral, even in the sense that Switzerland is, and Switzerland has given up its neutrality since the beginning of the Ukraine war, officially siding against Russia. Because again, geography is destiny at this point. Finland is surrounded by the EU, and so it is going to be devoured ever so slowly into the EU. Even if it never formally joins, it's definitely within the Western sphere of influence. Ukraine, on the other hand, slowly but surely is being absorbed by Russia. The longer this goes on, the less of Ukraine there will be left. And I don't even necessarily mean territorially. I think that the Russians may, I think that they're going to get up to a certain point to where they feel like they've gobbled up enough of Ukraine, and they're just going to choose to stop. But the more that Ukraine resists, the more resources they consume in trying to defend the undefendable, well, then the tougher the process of rebuilding and recovering in the rump state of Ukraine, the worse that their situation will become post-war. Whereas if the Ukrainians, even though I know this would be politically impossible, if they were just to take a hands-off approach and to essentially put themselves at Russia's mercy, because at this point it's proven pretty definitively that Ukraine cannot win. They can only slow the advance of Russia. If they just put themselves at their mercy, essentially declare all of Ukraine like a free city, in the tradition of old wars, they will have lost territory, a lot of territory, but they're going to lose that territory anyway, and they wouldn't have lost anything else. Whereas by fighting the war and trying to carry it on, they lose more and more resources, more and more young lives. More and more infrastructure is destroyed, more and more homes, more and more crops, all of this. And at the end of the day, the Russians are going to decide how much of Ukraine they want to control, how much they want within their own borders. I have made my statements in the past where I think that's going to be. I think they're going to go right up along the Dnieper River, or give or take. At the end of the day, Russia's territory will extend from Donbass all the way to Transnistria in the west, and up to Kharkov in the northeast, and the border will be a bit of a diagonal across the country. Russia wants the east and the south. They're going to take all of the coast, and in the end, Ukraine will be left with old Austrian Galicia as its core. Kiev may very well remain under the Ukrainian flag, or then again, the Ruskies may decide, you know what, maybe we should just cross the river and take that city too. Because by the time that the Russians get close to Kiev, I think that Ukraine will be so thoroughly defeated militarily and so mortally wounded that the Russians really could bite off as much as they can chew. And while I don't think that they want to gobble up areas where the people are going to be hostile and resistant to them, into the future, taking one city like Kiev, which of course has historical importance to them, it was the basis of what became the Russian Empire. It was the seed of Russia, the Kievan Rus. It's where the name Russia comes from. I think that at a certain point, it'll just be right there, and it'll be too tempting for them to resist. And I don't mean take any of the land around it. I just mean cross the river right there, take over the city itself, let whoever doesn't want to be under Russian rule leave. That'll make things much easier for the Russians. I think that's certainly what will happen. And wherever the Ruskies do draw the line in Ukraine, that will become Russia's new border with the West. And of course, I mean the Western world. Their border, will run along the border with Finland, down through the border with the Baltic states, then Poland, next to Belarus, because of course Belarus is going to be within the Ruski Mir, down through the south into Ukraine, completely cutting off Ukraine from the Black Sea. And I think that in due time, they will extend into Transnistria. It'll be right next to where Russian Ukraine ends. Transnistria will probably be annexed directly to Russia. And thanks to the embargoes of the EU and the US, these newly annexed Russian areas will be flush with surplus oil and grain and food. Meanwhile, folks in the West will have to wait in line for bread and gasoline. Forgive me for not being as sophisticated as the likes of Max Boot, who insists that this war in Ukraine is our war, and that we want to encourage the Ukrainians to keep fighting because it's the same as, they're basically fighting for us. But I just don't see any way of winning here. Everything that I see the West do is just making us lose more and more. And as someone who lives in the West, I don't want the West to lose. I want our leaders to be competent people. I want them to make good decisions. I want them to increase, do things that increase my prosperity. Obviously, politicians can't make you prosperous. They would like you to think that they can, because they want their voters to think that they're God. But at the very least, I don't want my politicians so blatantly reducing and hampering, my standard of living. I mean, now you have the West trying to cap the price of Russian oil and impose global price controls on Russian oil, something like $80 a barrel. They're going to tell everyone, including India and China, oh, you're not allowed to pay more than more than $80 for Russian oil. That's going to be illegal. I mean, it's like it's like the meme. You're going to have India and Russia shaking hands and say, yes, so I agree to pay $100 a barrel for oil. And the EU or the US is just going to come in there with their arms crossed and say, isn't there somebody you forgot to ask? They really think that they can limit Russia's oil revenue that way by just dictating what the price is going to be that they're going to be paid. And they had the gall to say that India and China are incentivized to go along with this scheme, because then they're going to be able to buy Russian oil at an even greater discount than they already are, because they're able to buy oil from Russia at a discount because the Europeans won't buy any Russian oil, and so the global market price is higher than what the Indians and the Chinese are paying to Russia per barrel. But it's not so much that the Indians and the Russians are getting a discount. In fact, they're probably paying more to Russia now than they used to. I can almost guarantee that. It's that the West is paying such a high premium for non-Russian oil. The West, the supposed home of capitalism that defeated the Soviet Union through superior understanding of economics and having better economies, because we understood how prices worked, and we let prices plan our economies rather than bean counters in some Politburo. Now, it's the West that's run by bean counters. It's the West that's being run by a Politburo, dictating what our economy should and shouldn't do, dictating what the price of goods should be, dictating what interest rates should be, what the price of money itself should be, dictating what the price of oil should be. Of course, dictating the price of assets like stocks, bonds, and real estate, as I've talked about so much on this channel. It is instead the Ruskies, the old Soviet Union, the Indians, and the Chinese, the still openly communist Chinese, who have a better grasp of market economics. It's truly disgraceful, and I think maximum in another 30 years, people are going to look back on this era as such a low point in the history of the West, in its intellectual prowess, in the quality of leadership, in the quality of the decisions made. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.